Welcome to Historic Calgary Week and tonight's presentation. We have two speakers tonight. Adrienne Dewsbury is the collection officer at Fort Calgary. She is originally from Thunder Bay, Ontario, traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. She graduated from the Museum Management and Curatorial Studies program at Fleming College. Adrienne interned at Lougheed House and then helped with the flood recovery team in High River for 2 years. She has a background in Greek archaeology and has participated in 2 archaeological digs. Adrienne started in historical sites as a summer interpreter at Fort William Historical Park, a fur trade site in Thunder Bay, and it ignited her love of sharing history. Her co-presenter, Allison Graham, is a historian and the program officer at Fort Calgary. She received her PhD in history from the University of Toronto in 2019. She now enjoys working as a public historian at the fort with interest in understanding a variety of subjects related to the site, including colonialism, policing, and crime. Turn it over to you two.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kate, for that introduction. And yeah, thank you to the folks at Historic Calgary Week for having us. Thank you to the folks at the library as well. It's been so painless to do this virtual program. So Adrienne and I are really excited to talk to you a little bit about reintroducing Fort Calgary. And we called it this because we imagine that a lot of you have probably heard of Fort Calgary. You probably know some stories. And what we're doing right now is kind of thinking about how we can reframe some of the stories, some of the things that you might know about Fort Calgary. So we like to start with this idea of complex stories because Fort Calgary, it is a really complex site. And the stories of this place, they can get a little bit complicated. They've been interpreted in different ways over time. And so we're excited to bring some evolving interpretations of the stories of this place to you today. It's also a shameless plug. We have a podcast that's called Complex Stories, which you can check out on our website. So the land at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow Rivers, it could be considered what a Canadian historian, Richard White, has called a middle ground. It's a place of gathering and encounter for Indigenous peoples, much more recently between Indigenous and non-Indigenous or European peoples. It's a place of cultural, human, and environmental interaction and world making. But it's also a place of colonization and violence, specifically of settler colonialism. And this created immense imbalances that we're still living with and reckoning with today. So we're going to share a few of these stories. We're going to talk about what I like to think of the many lives of Fort Calgary, of this site, to show just why this place is important to Calgary and even Western Canada more broadly. And it's important when I think about history, you know, it's good to have these complex stories. There's some good moments and obviously there's some bad moments, things that we would like to celebrate and things that might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. One of the joys of history to me is that we are looking at stories in different ways. And so some of what I say today might be very familiar. Some might be quite different from what you've heard before, and some might even be different than what our exhibits say. But that's what makes history so exciting, and that's also what makes a virtual presentation so exciting as well. If we have some time at the end, which I suspect we will, Adrienne and I would love to hear any stories that you might have about the Fort Calgary site, because we recognize that this has been a place of community and gathering for thousands of years. We know that, especially if there's some Chinook Society folks out there, you guys know a lot about Fort Calgary, and Adrienne and I we're relatively new to the organization and learning a lot. So we would love to know the stories that you have about this place. So before I start sharing about this site as Indigenous Territory, and it remains so today, I just want to mention that Adrienne and I are both settler colonial presenters, and Fort Calgary is a predominantly settler-run organization right now. So many of the Indigenous stories aren't exactly ours to tell. Indigenous realities overlap and intersect with, but they also complicate and challenge other histories of this site. Still, much of this history should be shared by highly experienced knowledge keepers. but I can provide some general information of this place as Indigenous lands. The Blackfoot, Yahi Nakota, Tsuut'ina, and Métis peoples each have their own distinct histories and ways of life associated with this place. They were here for much longer than the Northwest Mounted Police were here, much longer than our museum has been around. So as you probably know, Fort Calgary is a place in Blackfoot territory. And Blackfoot territory ranges from the North Saskatchewan River up north in Alberta to the Yellowstone River in Montana, from east of the Great Sand Hills in central Saskatchewan, and then also, of course, west to the Rocky Mountains. This place has been home to the Blackfoot peoples forever. It still is. According to Blackfoot elder Betty Bastian's account, Napi created humans at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers during what she calls the time of the ancestors. So this is a very important, significant place. Eldon Yellowhorn, he's from the Piikani Nation, and he's shared with us some stories about Mokinstis, the Blackfoot word for elbow, or the big bend in the river, what we call the confluence today. And he explained that, quote, in the old Blackfoot sign language, patting your elbow indicated that you were going to Mokinstis. So this place, the elbow, is, as Eldon says, quote, part of the metaphor that Blackfoot people used to make a mental map of the world, giving features of the landscape the names of body parts helped them make sense of the vastness of their country. Nose Hill is also a perfect example of this, that body part. So the Blackfoot moved through this vast territory seasonally. They followed the buffalo. Eldon Yellowhorn describes the confluence of the rivers as a, quote, gathering place where people made temporary towns when they set up their camps. So there was a safe river crossing just south of the Big Bend, which also made this place a natural meeting spot along the main Blackfoot traveling route that ran north to south. So Adrian's gonna quickly talk about this photo and then has some other images to share.
Thanks, Allison. So this right here is a copy that we have here at Fort Calgary of it. The original is actually in Saskatchewan at the RCMP Museum in Regina. But this was a charcoal drawing done by an unknown Northwest Mounted Police constable around 1877. And there's a legend that goes with it to explain what the numbers are. It was acquired by George C. King. There's a bridge nearby named after him, who sent it to his brother. And the cool thing about this picture is that it actually shows from the perspective of a Northwest Mounted Police officer that there was a lot of Indigenous people in the same area as them. So this is the Fort Calgary site, the confluence of the Bow and Elbow River. And you can see number 8, that is supposed to be Fort Calgary right there. Thank you, Allison. Then 5 and 6 and 7 are supposed to be sort of Hudson's Bay or other trading posts that are there. But you can see scattered throughout, both kind of a little bit up, number 10 there and number 12 as well. There's lots of teepees around the site that you can see. So showing that even at that time, the Northwest Mounted Police were aware that there was lots of Indigenous people at this site. So it's kind of cool because this is a drawing from the early periods of the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police. And we don't have many drawings from prior to that. Another cool indication of Indigenous occupation at Fort Calgary site is from some of the archaeological digs that have happened in the area over the last couple of decades. Now, on the actual property of Fort Calgary as it stands right now, they haven't found a lot of Indigenous artifacts, and that's because their goals were to dig past the Northwest Mounted Police era. They wanted to find the fort, and they stopped. But just west of us in East Village, they were doing lots of excavations due to redevelopment, things like that. And they were digging a little bit further down, and they happened to come across this ring of stones, which they wound up determining was part of a teepee ring. So I have the model from our education department on the right-hand side there to show you what a teepee looks like. The stones would have helped hold down the skin on the outside of the teepee, and they're the only parts of the teepee that remain in the archaeological record. There was a bison skull found at the same level, and by carbon dating that, they dated this teepee ring to 3,400 years ago approximately. So that's an Indigenous timeline that's even not that long ago, but it still shows that for thousands of years before the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police and Europeans, there was people here living here, spending time in this area.
Thanks, Adrian. What's really neat about this picture, I think that you can't tell, is it's actually underneath a parking lot, right?
Yeah, it's underneath the parking lot just west of Fort Calgary site.
Yeah, who would have thought? So moving on, when we think of Fort Calgary, I think a lot of us do think of the Northwest Manitoba Police. We start with the story of the Confederation of Canada, the creation of Canada as a country in 1867. And this is with, of course, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's desire to unify this new country called Canada by sending a paramilitary force, so part army military, part police, on their march west, and they eventually arrived at what would become Fort Calgary in 1875. However, there is a long history of colonialism before this moment that starts almost 400 years earlier, but it's still really relevant to situating in the kind of long-term Fort Calgary. So over the centuries, Europeans, the British in this case, they crafted laws and rationalized different acts of possession so that in their minds, they had the right to exploit and settle in lands all over the world. This is what we know today as settler colonialism. And these projects of settler colonialism, particularly in the Americas, were enacted in many different ways, but always without the regard for the millions of people that had already lived in these places for thousands of years, with their own ways of life, cultures, languages, and complex societies that already had political, spiritual, and legal structures. That's kind of one of the issues when we talk about the police, the Northwest Manitoba Police bringing law and order to this area, whereas the Blackfoot, for example, they had their own legal systems and their systems of law and order. So in what is today Western Canada, you have the Hudson's Bay Company. This is a fur trading company. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It was given the land in 1670 by the British Crown under their charter system. This is kind of how they divvied up territory. And this resulted in them claiming the ability to sell this land to the Canadian government about 200 years later. This is a really fast history lesson, hundreds of years. So when the Northwest Manitoba Police arrived, after fur traders, after other European explorers were sent out to scout, evaluate, and measure the territory, the Northwest Manitoba Police did this, believing that they were here to bolster a new authority of the government of Canada that they had just recently gained, despite the fact that Indigenous peoples had no idea this land had even been claimed by them. So the push for settler expansion in what is today Western Canada, or the colonization of the West, was also intimately connected to early versions of Canadian nationalism. And I think this is so interesting because according to the Canadian government, in order to build a Canada from sea to sea at that time that had a clear border to the south, they wanted to protect their territory from US invasion. This land had to be monitored by a police force and inhabited by British or Anglo-Canadian settlers. So despite being populated by diverse Indigenous populations, the Canadian government considered this space largely unused because it wasn't being, in their minds, properly cultivated. So that this land required settlement, and in part required settlement so that Canada could become the nation that we know it as today. So it's really interesting to me that you have these processes of colonization and nation building happening at the same time. And the Northwest Manitoba Police are at the heart of both of these processes, of both of these stories, really. So it's why they've become symbols of Canadian nationalism, of Canada, but they do also have these colonial roots. So, as I briefly mentioned already, the Northwest Manitoba Police were established in 1873 by John A. Macdonald, and they were sent on their march west in 1874. This started from Dufferin, Manitoba, and they were basically going to set up police forts and begin preparing the land for other settler colonial people. And I'll talk about a little bit what that meant later. So traditionally, the March West has been kind of glorified. It's made to sound very grand and heroic. It's contributed to these myths of the mounted police being these kind of legendary superheroes. You hear the stories of just like these manly men marching west without a struggle or anything like that. And to be sure, it was quite a feat for that time. But it was actually a pretty terrible experience. Many of the men, unsurprisingly, struggled with the march, and it wasn't as romantic as we sometimes have heard. So 275 officers went on this journey, and a lot of them probably didn't know what they were getting themselves into. Historian Daniel Francis, he talks a lot about these myths of Canada, and he goes so far as to call it an actual planning fiasco. 31 men deserted while camped in Dufferin. So before the march even started, they deserted. There are some accounts written by Northwest Manitoba Police doctors, including the Assistant Surgeon Richard Barrington-Nevitt. And those reveal a lot of the ailments and the injuries that the men had to get treated as they marched. So it didn't sound like a great time from what I've read. The march also, I think, demonstrates the colonial or colonizing goals of the mounted police force, starting from the Canadian government. This march to establish forts can be interpreted as a military campaign, which I think paints a different picture of the march. You know, traditionally, the Northwest Manitoba Police have been seen exclusively, almost exclusively, I should say, as peacemakers, as part of that mild West story that a police presence would prevent any violence. And that's not wrong. That's certainly one way that the story has been interpreted and told. But another way that the March West can be interpreted is connecting it more closely to colonization. So recently, there have been a couple historians who actually call the March West a colonial occupation. So it's a little bit of a different way of looking at it. So after the journey, they established Fort Macleod, named after James Macleod, who became the commissioner of the Northwest Manitoba Police. We have a statue of him outside. Then the F Troop, they came north to build the fort by the Bow River. It was eventually named Fort Calgary by Macleod, although there was a lot of contentious stuff that happened over the naming of the fort. Cecil Denny, a senior officer who was part of this March West, described in his memoir the moment when the mounted police approached this place, what would become the Fort Calgary site at the confluence of the rivers. And he described this site in a very romantic way. He talks about the rolling hills. I don't know if any of you have read his memoir, but it's really, snowy mountain peaks. It's all very beautiful. There were buffalo everywhere, which is kind of different than what we might think about. And he also wrote, quote, "Only a poet could do justice." So he really thought that this was just a beautiful place. We just discovered Denny was a poet of his own. So now his writing makes a lot more sense to me. But then he also wrote, quote, that "of man they saw no sign." They didn't see any people here. So to me, I think this is a really interesting line for the Great March West, that they come here and they think it's empty. They think nobody's using it. And it points to a misunderstanding of how this land was used. I mentioned Eldon Yellowhorn, who explains that Blackfoot settlement in particular was temporary at the confluence. So, it makes sense that Denny and the others wouldn't necessarily see anyone around, but that didn't mean that people were never here and that they weren't using this land and that they could just set up a fort here. It didn't mean that they could just start building. So it also demonstrates a kind of colonial idea that building a police fort would solidify the claims to this land that Canada, the Canadian government, had already made. Adrian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So just some artifacts that we have that can kind of talk about the March West and the Northwest Mounted Police. We've got some really cool ones. The first one is the picture here, which is a pith helmet replica, which is the one that looks like a normal pith helmet. And then the weird one next to it was actually found during one of the first archaeological excavations that happened here at Fort Calgary. In 1968, Ron Getty, funded by the Glenbow Museum, they did some test digs here at Fort Calgary before this became sort of the project that led to the museum. And I found a YouTube video of him online speaking here at Fort Calgary a couple of years ago about those excavations. And there's a funny story about this pith helmet. So in 1968, when they were digging, they found what would have been an outhouse at the time. And I quote Ron Getty right now, and he said, "What falls in an outhouse stays in an outhouse." So he started talking about how when the archaeologists found this blob with copper on top in this, what would be the refuse of the outhouse, they realized it was a pith helmet. Their imaginations ran wild. So archaeologists on site will do this all the time, where they go, "How did this pith helmet wind up in the outhouse?" So their theory was maybe it was a 2-hole outhouse, and someone really had to go when they were rushing in, and they took their helmet off but forgot to check if the hole next to them was closed or not. And they put their helmet down, and before they realized it was too late, it had fallen in, and they weren't going to be retrieving it back out. And so that's just kind of a funny story of how we actually got to keep this in the archaeological record. And it's been restored and conserved by the Canadian Conservation Institute a couple of years ago. So it is very well mounted, so that way it keeps its form. But the cork is what's preserved, and we have in bags the copper that was on it. And the thing about the pith helmet is it was not a functional headwear out here in the Canadian West. It was part of the sort of British military uniform in other parts of the world, but it was not really that functional. And by the 1880s, so not long after the Northwest Mounted Police arrived out west, it was reserved largely for formal dress. And by 1901, it was almost abolished completely for all ranks except for the officers' full dress. Now, the next thing I want to show you is actually in person. So if Allison, you want to leave the slideshow, I'm going to tilt my computer a little bit so you guys can see it, because I don't want to lift this up. This is actually, sorry, I'm going to try and get that there. There we go. This is a scrapbook of Sir Cecil Denny's stuff. So he didn't actually make this scrapbook. It kind of showed up in about 1982 with no background. We don't know who made it, but it was indexed by Clifford Rawthorne from the RCMP Veterans Association. And it's really neat because it has some original letters to or from Sir Denny. It has excerpts from his what would be his memoirs. It has some of the poetry that Allison mentioned. I'm just trying to find the page there. So just right here, we found some poetry of his, which is really neat to have this. We don't know who put it together. There's also some articles about him in it, but it's one of the cool items that we have that pertains to one of the sort of key members of that march west to found Fort Calgary. Another little interesting one that I can pull up here, it's a little easier to pick up, is a compass that Sir Denny gave to someone. We're not 100% sure if he used it for years and then gave it away, but it was once owned by Sir Denny, which is very, very cool, having something that belonged to one of the sort of key officers in the creation of Fort Calgary.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. Yes, Denny wrote a poem about the autumn leaves falling. So it's, I don't know if he was considered a great poet, but you know, it's nice to read it. Very different than what you would think from a Northwest Mounted Police officer. All right, so the Northwest Mounted Police weren't the only people coming to this site in Blackfoot territory. An important part of the community that developed in and around this site were Métis traders and their families. And I already mentioned the Hudson's Bay Company, which had been around for hundreds of years prior to the Northwest Mounted Police outpost here. But the Métis had also been in this area decades before the Northwest Mounted Police, likely around the 1840s. But there was an influx of permanent Métis settlement in this area around the 1860s and 70s, the Gaudin family being one of the first. John Bunn is probably one of the more well-known Métis traders for the Hudson's Bay Company. It's thought that Bunn relocated his HBC post near Ghost River by actually disassembling it, taking apart the building and floating the logs downriver to the confluence. So by the late 1875, early 1876, this HBC post, it was in operation. And while it wasn't as big of a trading operation as, say, Fort Edmonton, there were at least 4 HBC buildings in the area, likely including 2 of these log cabins, which are on the Fort Calgary site today. So the Hunt House, which we think was built by John Bunn, and the Métis cabin as well. And the Hunt House, you're probably familiar with. It's the oldest building in Calgary to remain in its original location. So growing trading activity, like I said, brought more Métis families to the area. And so what's really interesting is some of the earliest communities and neighborhoods that surround Fort Calgary today, like Inglewood, Ramsey, the East Village, these were Métis or predominantly Métis communities. So if you're interested in more Métis history on this site, Matthew Hilterman has shared quite a bit of information about the different families here with us. You can check out, we had an outdoor audio tour that's still up on our website where he chats a little bit about those families that settled along the Elbow River predominantly. We also have, again, a podcast episode interviewing Matt, and he says lots of really good stuff. And what I kind of like about talking about the different communities, different families that popped up around this site is that it reminds us that the Northwest Mounted Police weren't actually alone. There were a lot of other things going on. There was a city growing around this area. It also reminds us that the Northwest Mounted Police had a lot of interactions and they had a lot of help too. They certainly had skills to endure in a place that was new to them, but they depended on Indigenous people for their survival, including the Blackfoot when it came to knowledge of the land, but also the Métis in terms of trade and interpretation. So it just kind of shows, again, broadening these stories. Adrian, do you want to talk a little bit about the photos here?
Yeah, so it's just basically sort of a before and after photo. So the reason the Hunt House sort of never left where its original site, unlike the Métis cabin, which went to Calgary Malting and Brewing and then came back to its close to its original site. The Hunt House was actually occupied. William Hunt lived there from about 1947 until 1975 when he passed away, and it was willed to the city of Calgary. So that picture on the top sort of left is from December 1985, before some restoration of it took place, not to the extent of what you see on the picture on the left. It had another phase in between this, but it was sort of tidied up a little bit. The extensions were kept for a number of years, but when in about 2015, they did some major restorations on the Dean House and the Hunt House. They removed the extensions and the shingles and did actually try and bring the Hunt House back to what it would have looked like originally. It wouldn't have been white, that color. That color is actually a paint that's going to help to preserve it for many years to come. But this would have been what the Hunt House looked like in about 1876, roughly, when it was built. And it's one of the few remaining Hudson's Bay original buildings that still exists in the province of Alberta today. So it's a really important provincial historical resource. And it's really great to have it on our site.
All right, so back to the Northwest Mounted Police a little bit. I referred earlier about some of the different things that they were doing to kind of prepare this area for settlement. And those are some of their earlier duties, but they had a pretty wide-ranging docket, I guess, on their plate, all to establish what was considered by the Canadian government a kind of proper and orderly society. So when they first got to this site, there were some early activities that they were here for. Building the fort was an obvious priority. So there were a few different Northwest Mounted Police forts between 1877 and 1884. And these were all connected by smaller outposts. So this created a network of forts, which facilitated how they would police. It facilitated patrolling. But the forts also created a symbolic statement of this new government having military power over the area. So it was very important both on a practical, but also this kind of symbolic level. They built the first version of Fort Calgary shortly after they arrived in 1875, but the building did not last very long. It was poorly constructed. It began to fall apart. So they built another Fort Calgary on top of the original one, and this was here until 1914. That's where, if you see the art installation marking, that's where it's currently located. Adrian will talk about that a little bit more. The site contained a number of other buildings that related to the Northwest Mounted Police, but also see like the beginnings of what a town would have. So of course, the barracks where the officers lived and slept, different houses for the higher up officials. They also built the first prison, which I'll talk about a little bit, and also the first hospital in this area. So they were busy building. One of the other early duties that they had was the whiskey trade. And you've probably heard a lot about this story that the Northwest Mounted Police came here to stamp out the whiskey trade. And that's certainly true. That's definitely one of the things that MacDonald had on his mind. They predominantly wanted to stop Americans from the US crossing the border and selling illegal whiskey to Indigenous peoples. And this whiskey, it's not like the whiskey that we enjoy today. It was laced with toxic ingredients. It was causing a lot of harm, a lot of death to Indigenous peoples. So there is evidence that the Blackfoot people were very concerned about this and also welcomed the help of the Northwest Mounted Police here. And so as a result, it was actually this kind of way of establishing diplomatic relations with some of the Indigenous peoples here, particularly with the Blackfoot, that they could establish these good relations by helping out with policing the whiskey trade. And then also, kind of along a similar vein of diplomacy and negotiating, they were here for Treaty 7. So when it came to the signing of Treaty 7, this was the first treaty where the Mounties played a more central role. They had largely observed the signing of Treaty 6 the year before, but for Treaty 7, they made all of the signing preparations. And James McLeod, he was appointed the Assistant Treaty Commissioner. So he was directly involved in these negotiations. So one of their early duties that's kind of unique to this area was establishing these diplomatic relations. And the goal was to ensure that a treaty was signed with the Indigenous peoples here. So according to the Canadian government, this treaty would secure the surrender of lands so that they could proceed with the expansion of a settler colonial society. There was a book published in the 1990s called The True Spirit and Original Intent of Treaty 7. And they wanted to approach elders to get a better sense of how different Indigenous peoples in the area interpreted the signing of Treaty 7. And many of them share Indigenous perspectives of the Northwest Mounted Police and their role at the time, which is great because a lot of what we have in the written record is the Canadian government and the Northwest Mounted Police perspective. So in this book, just to give you one example, John Yellowhorn, as a hereditary chief of the Piikani, he explained that Bullhead, the main chief there, had met with McLeod, and McLeod said that he was there to sign a treaty and that him and the Redcoats, the Northwest Mounted Police, were sent here by the Queen to live in harmony, to share the land in peace, and to protect their people. That's not exactly what ended up happening. And for a couple years, really from 1875 to 77, there were vague discussions of a treaty, which caused the members of the Blackfoot Confederacy to actually create a petition of grievances based on what they called the invasion of their lands. And they wanted these to be resolved before a treaty was actually signed. But fast forward to 1877, so Crowfoot signed on behalf of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And when he eventually decided to do this, it was a conflicted decision. He was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because he knew that this treaty would possibly bring difficulties to his people. But, he was kind of deceived in a way about the real purpose of the treaty, which ended up forcing Indigenous peoples to surrender their land. So when it came time to sign the treaty at Blackfoot Crossing, McLeod signed on behalf of the Canadian government and the Queen. And so that's why he's been really largely cited for his diplomatic duties early on. There's also this interesting kind of, again, it can be interpreted in different ways, that the Northwest Mounted Police brought guns, they brought cannons to the signing. For some, this is seen as a celebratory commemorative act. For others, it's been perceived as an intimidation tactic, right, to bring guns to the signing of the treaty. So after these earlier duties, these kind of more what historians have interpreted as largely diplomatic relations, they kind of shifted into more of what you would think of as a policing role. Although I would argue that their mandate was always to police people, and including Indigenous peoples. So the Northwest Mounted Police were involved to varying extents in the displacing and criminalizing of Indigenous peoples and their ways of life. It was their job, essentially, to enforce assimilationist goals of the Canadian government. And this is largely seen through the Indian Act that created the reserves, which restricted access to traditional territories. Officers also regulated the pass system, which prevented Indigenous peoples from leaving reserves unless they possessed a permit. And there were some officers that had actually a lot of problems. They disagreed with the pass system. So again, that was really complicated as well. Lots of different ways to think about that. There are other ways that the Northwest Mounted Police were involved in kind of the detriment of Indigenous peoples and their ways of life. So they were involved in limiting food distribution to reserve based on starvation policies. Again, there were some officers that came out and spoke against these starvation policies, Denny being one of them. Some began charging Indigenous peoples with the crime of vagrancy. Vagrancy is kind of similar to, I guess, homelessness today. And this, again, was all about kind of preventing the mobility and travel around territory that was traditionally for Indigenous peoples. They also began to more heavily police horse and cattle stealing. And this was a crime that also disproportionately targeted Indigenous peoples. Some argue this was as a result of the starvation policies. So it's just complicated stuff. They also policed the emerging settler community. So it wasn't just about policing Indigenous peoples, although that was certainly an early duty of theirs. But the whole goal was to get this settler population going. And the police were there to make sure everyone was behaving properly. So this started with the Canadian Pacific Railway, or the CPR, that came here in 1883. And so their goal was to kind of police folks involved with the railway. One superintendent in the early 1880s actually blamed an increase in crime on the railway. So it had a kind of sinister reputation, I guess. Following the CPR, the Northwest Mounted Police were also, as I said, policing this growing settler population, which really starts at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. So there were numerous reports at this time about the poor conditions of the prison at Fort Calgary, and this was because of overcrowding. So it wouldn't have been a fun place to end up, but it does seem like the police, the Northwest Mounted Police, were quite busy. So the early 20th century, this is also the time that Captain Richard Dean came to lead the Northwest Mounted Police at Fort Calgary, known for building the Dean House, obviously. And so his memoir is an interesting example. It explores one perspective of what kind of crimes were being policed from around 1906 to 1914. Now, according to Dean, as I mentioned, there were these complaints about overcrowding in the prisons, and Dean kind of corroborated this. He said that his division was extremely busy, that they had about 60 officers, and he supervised 20 to 25 detachments extending into the Rocky Mountains. So he was a busy guy. And in his memoir, you know, he does a little bit of complaining about all of the requests of people asking the Northwest Mounted Police to do this and do that. But he does appear to favor the more salacious stories of crime in Calgary. So focusing, I'm guessing he wanted to kind of do the shock and awe thing for his readers. So he did focus on some more extreme crimes like murder. 4 men were hanged at the Fort Calgary site between 1884 and 1914, each for committing murder. Ernest Cashel is probably the most famous example because he escaped from the prison so many times prior to his execution. But around Dean's time, he actually talks about John Fisk, who became a kind of infamous murderer. He killed Tucker Keach in 1910 because he was basically a rancher hermit who lived by himself. And so he felt like he could kill him and then, quietly just take his land. So that's kind of what Dean likes to focus on. He likes the juicy stuff, understandably. So although he downplayed a lot of other crimes, what was actually being policed during this time were typically considered crimes of morality. So Canada's first criminal code of 1892 outlined these laws that the Northwest Mounted Police implemented. And they were largely concerned with enforcing, again, what would be a proper Canadian Anglo-colonial society, this proper behavior. So these laws began turning people who experienced mental illness, homelessness, or who engaged in sex work into social outsiders and ultimately into criminals. These were people who were perceived as transgressing social boundaries. So something that we see in Dean's memoir is that imprisonment in this time period, either as a criminal or some people were designated lunatics, quote, in the hospital. But imprisonment was perceived as a way to preserve this kind of delicate stability of the new emerging society, and in a way also to kind of help people. It sounds strange, but it's kind of before welfare systems and all that stuff that we think about today. And as an interesting side note, well, it's interesting to me, Dean expressed special concern about the number of women ending up in the Fort Calgary prison and asylum. He notes that on average, they would have about 25 women imprisoned, which he says was double the number that their, quote, accommodation expected. So this is really interesting to me because we're still in the early 20th century here, and there weren't that many women around, actually. So I'm very interested in why he's focusing on these stories, maybe because there weren't so many women. So it was kind of, a shocking thing. Maybe he was trying to garner empathy by pulling at people's heartstrings of these sort of sad, lost women that ended up being imprisoned. It kind of shows the Northwest Mounted Police as being more of a caring, kind of paternal institution. There's a lot to unpack. I could talk a lot about the prisons and different things about crime, but I'm sure we're also going to learn more about that in the future. So as you can imagine, of course, officers not always consistent with policing, especially when it came to these crimes of morality, things like drinking, gambling, sex work, running brothels. These things persisted. Sometimes the officers were involved with them as well. There's an example of a Constable Shepherd who actually stole a keg of whiskey that had previously been confiscated from the train. It was illegal whiskey in 1887. So, the officers weren't perfect either, and enforcement of the laws wasn't either. But still, I think it's interesting. A lot of these laws that were in development in this time period, they're quite relevant to how we think about crime today. So that was a really quick interpretation of the history of the Northwest Mounted Police here. And I just want to conclude this kind of Northwest Mounted Police story with a reminder that it is just one of many, but it happens to be the one story that we know the most about. Why is that? Well, it's for a lot of different reasons. The one reason that I like to think about as a historian is that the Northwest Mounted Police loved paperwork. They were kind of like bureaucrats, and they produced many written sources. Some of them were destroyed, but a lot still survived. And traditionally, historians, we love written sources. That written record has been preserved and privileged in many ways that other sources, like Indigenous oral traditions, haven't been. We can also see over the 20th century, the creation of these myths surrounding the Mounties. They became these heroes of Canada. So of course we want to know more about them. But it's important to remember that there are kind of systemic and also colonial reasons for why this story has been privileged for so long. Adrienne, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Allison. So I just have some cool artifacts, again, relating to the policing of the Northwest Mounted Police. I don't know much about these particular individual items, but I do have examples of the two early sort of firearms that the Northwest Mounted Police would have used in the very early days of arriving here at Fort Calgary. So the first one here, I'll step back a bit so everyone can see it. This is a Snyder Enfield carbine, which was the original shoulder arm of the force when they first got out here. And then I also have a Adams revolver Model 2, which was the first sidearm of the force. And sort of the funny thing about these is both were severely outdated by the time shortly after they arrived out west. So they got their new firearms, and already at that point, the Americans and a lot of other groups had more advanced weaponry than these two. So they were quickly outdated. But that's it for that. Just wanted to show those.
Great. This map is a archaeological site map. So you can just see a little bit of what the layout of the site kind of looked like.
So the neat thing about this is it's from Aresco Limited, who did the two archaeological surveys in 1975 and 76. And this was done a little bit later than after those two digs. And it kind of shows you where the buildings were from the entire time the Northwest Mounted Police were here. So in the center, you can see the 1875 fort, and then around it, the larger cluster of buildings is from the 1880s through to the 1914 when it was given to the railway.
So moving along forward in time, although Fort Calgary, as we know, it's known as this Northwest Mounted Police Fort, they were actually on this site for a fairly short time, just less than 40 years. And this is especially short considering this was Blackfoot territory for thousands of years, remains so today. But we're learning all of these different stories about kind of beyond the Northwest Mounted Police. So as early as the 1910s, the presence of the mounted police on this site was becoming a little bit more contentious. The town of Calgary had been incorporated. They were creating their own police force quite a few years prior. And some politicians in the new city didn't actually want the Northwest Mounted Police anymore. Some people did too, so it was a bit of a debate. But for some, the Northwest Mounted Police were accused of trampling on people's rights because of their judicial powers. So the Northwest Mounted Police were also unique in the extent of their judicial powers. Not only could they arrest someone, but they could also judge, convict, and imprison them and potentially execute them. So that was seen as a kind of into the 20th century, not sure about civil rights with that stuff. And they also began to receive less support from the federal government, which is why they were created in the first place. So in 1914, Fort Calgary was closed. And this was something that was in the works for a while. By 1907, there were already talks about selling the site to a railway developer. And that's what ended up happening in 1914. The site and the buildings were sold to the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway. The Dean House was one of the only buildings preserved, and that was moved across the Elbow River to its current site in 1929. I know Ruth Manning did an excellent tour about the Dean House. She's the Dean House expert, so if you have any questions about that, she's certainly the person to ask. All other buildings, they were demolished to build a railway terminal. And so for me, this transitional period brings us into a different story of the Fort Calgary site. And this is a story of industrialization. Western Canada was part of what is often considered a second wave of industrialization, kind of around the 1890s to the 1950s. And this is about 100 years later than Britain's Industrial Revolution, which we kind of think about. This was often referred to as the development of the West by Canadian politicians at the time. And so this process included the mechanization of agriculture and farming, more coal mining in the mountains, increased technology for communication and transportation. So railways, for example. So Fort Calgary site sold to the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway for about $250,000. That's approximately close to $6 million today, so not bad. Again, this railway, similar to the CPR, was still part of a nation building project. They wanted to provide more connection, this time between Northern and Central Canada, as opposed to the CPR, which operated closer to the Canada-US border. This railway, under the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, only operated for a few years. It ended up going bankrupt in 1919. However, during that time, they did change this site significantly into this railway yard. They established a telegraph service for communication, freight, passenger, and mail transportation. So this was all to support this kind of emerging city, but also to support industry, urbanization, all of these kinds of intertwined processes. Once the railway went bankrupt, though, we see other industries using this site, but it still sticks around transportation and shipping. So McCosham's Warehouse, they were a shipping company that actually wanted to compete with the railway. It started with horse-drawn drays or wagons in the 1910s, and eventually they focused on motor trucks to transport freight by the 1950s. The CNR, the Canadian National Railway, took over the tracks and the terminal at this time. So the site was still used as a distribution hub and a shipping yard for nearly 50 years. And we don't know a lot about this time and what really happened on this site. I'm sure there's some really interesting stuff. So if you've heard anything about this kind of industrial time, we'd be really interested in learning more. The development of these industries, they, like everything on this site, can be interpreted in different ways. You see the good and the bad. They were good because they contributed to the growth of Calgary as a city. By the time the Northwest Manitoba Police left the site, it's estimated that there were about 65,000 people living in Calgary. This was a jump from a mere 15,000 in 1906. And this number continued to grow. The population was booming. So growing industry, growing transportation allowed the city to establish a sustainable economy and a population that would eventually turn Calgary into the largest city in what became Alberta. On the flip side, though, industrialization continued the environmental degradation that colonization started. The land was seen as only being useful if resources could be extracted from it, or it could somehow benefit growing industry. So we can see specifically at the Fort Calgary site, even today, this land is still heavily impacted by its former life as a railway terminal and shipping yard. You just have to try to stick something in the ground and you'll know it's not quite as it should be. Adrian, do you want to talk about this map?
Yes, this was actually an interesting map that I found recently while going through some of the archive papers that we have here at Fort Calgary. And it just really does show what the site looked like kind of in about the mid-1950s. So right about at its height before it was cleared for the museum in the 70s. And so you can see 6th Street and then the McCosham's Warehouse is it's talked about a lot because it was actually a bit of a problem, but also a savior in a lot of the archaeological excavations because it kind of covered part of the 1875 fort, some of which was destroyed by the rail yards and the other buildings, some of it which was preserved underneath the buildings that were there. So it's interesting to see kind of where it went at one point. And there was lots of things that they found in archaeological excavations on the site and also sort of around the pond area where the bridge is and in East Village as well. So I think on the next slide, I have a picture of, they found an old Model T Ford car. So this is a wheel from that car. I think they found the license plate as well. That managed to get preserved there. There was also some incinerators in the East Village area that had a lot of cool finds from that time period. And of course, they did find a lot of items related to the railway. They found a roundhouse, which is really cool. I don't have a picture of it, but that's where they would turn the trains around. So they found the remains of that. And also I think lots of people still find these just as their walking places, the railway spikes that would keep the wood and the metal in place.
So one of the last, more recent stories that we can tell about this site starts in the 1960s as Fort Calgary as a museum and an archaeological site. So this is when the City of Calgary Alderman John Ayer began a civic initiative to restore interest in Fort Calgary. This effort was partly inspired by Canada's centennial in 1967. So again, this kind of reoccurring theme of nation building continues to intersect with the Fort Calgary site. He faced a bit of an uphill battle. It wasn't as easy as you would hope. The site was still owned by the CNR, and they didn't really want to give up the land until they had a promised land exchange, which did end up happening in the 70s. So he chaired a Fort Calgary committee in the planning of the centennial, Calgary centennial in 1975. And he petitioned for this land to be used predominantly for a museum that would share the story of the Northwest Manitoba Police. The RCMP veterans were also involved in this project at the time. So by 1973, the city of Calgary was able to purchase the land back to establish the site for the museum, which opened in 1978. They also started their archaeological digs around that time, and there were more digs in the 80s and 90s. So Adrian's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'll do this quickly because I did kind of talk about it a little bit throughout, but in 1968, before any development happened on the site, they did some test pits to try and figure out where to dig, where not to dig, where to build things, where not to build things, where to tear things down carefully. And that's when they were able to kind of determine that there was more exploration that needed to occur. So in 1969 and 1970, Ron Getty, again, kind of funded by the Glenbow Museum, did more extensive excavations, this time to find the architectural plan of the original fort. And this was pre-McCosham's warehouse coming down. So the building was still there. So they were kind of digging up to McCosham's warehouse. And then in 1975 and 1976, Oresco Limited did even more extensive excavations to uncover more area and uncover archaeological remains that were under the former McCosham's warehouse, which was now torn down. So we can skip through to the next slide. And so here's I have so many pictures of the digs from 1975 and 1976. Lots of people working very hard these years. They found so many features as we go forward. The cool thing was in the Oresco digs, they did find some of the original posts of the 1875 fort that were still in the ground at the time that they found them. Which is really neat because often wood and organic material decomposes and degrades in the archaeological record. And usually for post holes, you find different colored dirt rather than the actual post itself. So that was a pretty interesting find, considering it was about 100 years after the fort was built and a little less than about 90 years after it came down. And then so you can keep going forward a bit, just showing some fun slides because we found these pictures. So it's fun to share them of some of the glass bottles that were found in situ, which I have in storage behind me. And some of the hardworking archaeologists have done that work. It's exhausting and finding out lots of information. Here's some images from the 1990 excavation. So they did some digs in the 80s as well. They did some more digs in the 90s to locate the remains of deeper foundations. And this was done through the University of Calgary Archaeology Program and their public archaeology program, which they actually were doing at least still up pre-COVID. I actually got to participate in that at Blackfoot Crossing. And then once did all the excavations, they were able to start planning for the building of the physical museum. So I've also found while going through lots of paper here at Fort Calgary, some of the original proposals of what they were proposing to build for the museum, for the interpretive center. And some of these were from about the 1970s. I don't have exact dates, but they were clearly kind of right around the time they were doing the archaeological excavations. So the next slide's a bit zoomed in here. This actually would have had the museum on the western side of the property. And we would have entered the museum from 6th Street rather than 9th Avenue. They wanted to have sort of a covered area over top of the archaeological remains and this little kind of almost honeycomb-esque shaped building. And so here's the larger picture of how the parking lot would have been on a completely other side of the property. And if you want to go to the next one. Oh, this is just a zoomed into that one. This one's really neat because it shows another proposal had an underground building. So the museum proper would have been kind of partially subterranean with a glass sort of transparent shelter over top of the ruins that they had proposed to be left exposed or partially covered. I'm not sure who nixed that. I thought if it was the archaeologists or if it just wasn't within the budget, because they did wind up recovering the posts for safety, for preservation purposes. This one's one of my favorite proposals that I found. If you want to go to the next slide that has a sort of zoomed in version. They had us in the northeast corner of the property, so still entering from 9th Avenue, but they had a trolley system in place. And with the trolley system would also connect us to St. Patrick's Island, where they were going to build a biodome. I don't know if they thought that we would have tons and tons of money to build this, but I thought that was really cool. There would have been a watchtower on the property as well. So you can zoom in a little bit. Yeah, so you can see the Riverside Trolley Simulation Center is what they called the museum. So I thought that was kind of an interesting proposal as well. So that's kind of the end of our presentation, I think. Back to you, Allison.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I just skipped over the question slide because I feel like we'll wrap it up and then go to questions. But thank you so much again for coming and listening to us chat. This is just like one glimpse of a couple of different stories that we're telling about this site. As we move forward, we recognize that there's so much more to learn and so much more to share. So we are excited to kind of continue on a journey and reinvigorating Fort Calgary. And so, yeah, if you have any questions or comments, we're happy to hear them.
So our first question is, was it a carbine percussion cap rifle?
Yeah, the carbine is a percussion cap rifle, not a flintlock.
Perfect. All right. So the next one, I'm so sorry if I mispronounce this name, but how does Brice Boris being common law with a Métis wife fit into the NWMP narrative?
Brisbois.
Brisbois, yeah.
Okay.
Good. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Adrian, did you?
Nope.
I assume a lot of Northwest Manitoulin officers had relationships with Métis women. That is a big assumption. But I think that would be really interesting to delve into because there was a lot around officers in particular, not Brisbois, but like lower down officers having to be single, unmarried. But we know that a lot of them engaged in different types of relationships with women, local women, including Indigenous women. But that's a really interesting question. Brisbois, I always think of because he's the one who wanted to name the fort after himself. And that got a little bit of an uprising, a bit of a mutiny. So that's what I think about when I think about him. But that's a really interesting question. I would love to know more of what you know.
Very interesting. Yeah, he sounds like a very slightly full of him kind of guy, wanting to name the whole fort after himself.
Yeah, from what I understand, he's a bit of a character.
All right. So Adrian, we have some questions, but where are you? What room are you standing in?
She's in the best room. She's in the best room.
So we thought it would be fun since this is virtual and I can actually come to you live from the Fort Calgary storage facility. So behind me is my storage unit. I have one of the aisles open right now. So this is where I keep all of these artifacts when I'm not showing them to you guys or they're not on exhibit. So this keeps them nice and safe. This is where I spend a good chunk of my time.
Very cool. It's very cool to get a little glimpse virtually into somewhere we wouldn't see otherwise. So our next question is from Elizabeth. Is there a list of NWMP members?
Yeah, there would be in the archives. You can get all of their documents, their registration documents, in the Canada Library and Archives. What's it called? Library and Archives Canada, and it's actually accessible online. So, while I couldn't personally list all of the Northwest Manitoulin Police members, but that is accessible online. It's actually really interesting. You can see who signed up. Some kind of basic demographic details about them, but yeah, there is, and you can find it online.
Perfect. Could you repeat just one last time the name of the website, just so people can jot it down?
Is it the Library Archives of Canada? Canada Library Archives. They've changed their name. But it's if you Google Library and Archives of Canada, Northwest Manitoulin Police, you will find it.
Perfect. All right. So Christine asked, where was the Hudson Bay Post that is still on the site when it was owned by the railway?
So the Hudson's Bay Company Post, so the Hunt House it's on the eastern side of the Elbow River. So where the Dean House stands today, that's not the original site of the Dean House. That was moved across the river. But the Hunt House was left on it was still there. And actually during the time of the railway on the Fort Calgary site, that is when William Hunt was actually living in the Hunt House.
Very cool. Very cool. Is there any last tidbits of knowledge you would like to leave us with?
Come to Fort Calgary. We're doing some great stuff. We're super interested. Like I said, I know the folks who go to the Historic Calgary Week events are super smart and dedicated historians and history nerds, which we are too. So if you have any stories that you would like to tell us, my name's Allison, that's Adrian, and we would love to hear from you.
Perfect.
Our emails can be found on the Fort Calgary Facebook or webpage or under the contact side.
Perfect. Well, on behalf of the Calgary Public Library, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and getting to see such cool artifacts. I'm going to pass everything over to Kate for some closing remarks, but thank you so much.
Thank you to our speakers, Adrian and Allison. Very interesting. Living in East Village, it was really neat to see the teepee rings there underneath the parking lot. And to our moderator, Catherine, and Calgary Public Library, Zorica, thank you. Please remember to check out our website at chinookhistory.ca for information regarding all our Historic Calgary Week programs, virtual and in person, and how to join our society and how to support our programs.